Last week we looked at aspects of women in the 18th century. We looked at, sorry, that was also, we talked, 2 weeks ago we talked about aspects of women. We've had a little bit of material about women in the novel and the epistolary novel. So I've been talking about those kinds of topics, and slightly changed the order of things today. I thought it might be a good time to talk about the early feminism. Proto means kind of early or beginning. So proto-feminism. We do need to be a little bit careful about the words that we use when we're talking about this. So I'll start by defining terms. We need to think about the words that we use, and feminism is one of those words that's a little bit difficult to use sometimes, or we have to explain how we're using it, or what we want to communicate by using such a word. I think anyway in Japan, for some people, the word feminist is misunderstood. They don't think of it as the rights of women. They don't think about it as being men and women are byodo, so much as feminism for some. I think 20 years ago, a lot of students would think that feminism meant feminine, joseiteki. Okay? I think it's changing. I hope that most of you have the idea that what we're talking about here is, men and women being byodo in the society. That's what we mean by feminism. So if we just get that one clear before I kind of even start. The next issue, the next question about feminism is, where does the word come from? Well, that meaning of the word, the rights of women, or the equality of rights for men and women, that's really a 19th century thing. Jane Austen could never have said that she was a feminist or that she wasn't a feminist, because that word didn't exist. Okay? So we need to be a little bit careful, and we need to understand the time frame that the word feminist, like a lot of the words that we use today about the past, those words maybe didn't exist in that time. We need to show that we understand that. All right? Also, of course, there are things like students often write a paper like, is Charlotte Bronte a feminist? Feminist, okay, there can be all kinds of different feminists. It's like saying, is John Wilson a nice guy? Sometimes he's nice. Sometimes he can be really horrible. Okay? He failed me. He failed my paper. He's not nice. Okay? He's a bad guy. Okay? Sometimes he can be really horrible. Okay? No, you can't say she is a feminist. And also, especially, if you say, is she a feminist in the 1960s meaning, or today's meaning? Well, of course not. Okay? Is she a feminist because she thinks there should be gay marriage and women should be able to marry each other? She never even had the idea. Okay? How could she? I mean, it wasn't part of her society. But was she a feminist in the sense that she thought men and women should have the same right to education? Yes. Okay? Was she a feminist in the sense that she felt when a man married a woman, she should still be an equal human being to him? Yes. Okay? So, you have to think about feminist としてどういう意味で言ってる? Okay? What are you thinking of? There are いろんな feminism の種類. There are different stages of feminism, different ideas about it. So you have to think about this period and the way people would the way people would think in those days. So the word feminism is a fairly new word. But the idea of feminism, the idea that men and women are equal, and onaji gurai ningen, and so on, well, of course, that goes back a very long time. We can find it in the writings of the Greeks. We can find it Nisen nemae no, okay, Girisha no bungaku toka. We can find it in different literatures going back thousands of years. So, when we're talking about ideas that come before the name of feminist, before the word of feminist, before people really start openly saying the rights of women, we often call that this proto-feminist, early feminism or before feminism. So when I'm talking about feminism here, I'm talking about a kind of proto-feminism, or people who are expressing the idea that women and men should have equal treatment. Hi, ganbatte. At the same time, their way of thinking may have been different from today. Like I say, for example, what sort of rights should gay people have in society? Well, in medieval Europe, they would usually just kill them or something. You know, they didn't have a question of having any rights, all right? Something like that. Societies change, ways of thinking change. For this period, the big thing would be, really the main thing is education for women, okay? It's not about can women vote, it's not about can women be doctors, can women go to the moon if a man can go, you know, can a woman do all the same things? Just give us the same education and then see what we can do. Okay, so that was like the first education, is the kind of starting point. Well, let's try to understand the way things were in that society at that time. Yes, anybody coming in late, please check the register and take a print from the front there. There were two early kind of 18th century or even 17th to 18th century early proto-feminist branches. One is Tory, the other is Enlightenment. Tory is connected with the political right wing. Okay? The Tory party, I will talk a little bit about politics. I bet you can't wait. I will talk a little bit about politics later on. Tory equals right wing politically. Whig was left wing. So the political right was the Tory party. Why they had those names, it's a little bit fushigi, but it's not really important. We can look a little bit at them later on. Now, I keep saying last week, it's not last week, it's 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the blue stockings. Well, even before the blue stockings, there were people like Margaret Cavendish, Judith Drake, Mary Astell in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. And they were interested in women's position in society, and they're often called Tory feminists, kind of right-wing feminism. Again, for us today, that might be confusing. If you think about feminism in connection with politics, maybe you think more that it's a left-wing thing. Okay? Left-wing tends to be more about liberal society, thinking about changes in society. right-wing thinking tends to be more about structure, men at the top, women underneath it. It sort of seems to suit the right-wing way of thinking more. And yet, the very early feminists of the late 17th and early 18th centuries were mostly from the political right wing. That in itself is a confusing thing, and needs a little bit of explanation. Why would that be? Well, yeah, Tory is right wing, and of course today we have the Conservative Party, which is the political party, Imano Igirisu no Sori Daijin Toka, is the Conservative Party. Whereas the Whigs developed into the Liberal Party, and the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party has continued as a single party for hundreds of years. The Liberal Party has broken up into smaller groups or has been divided politically. You had Liberal, Jimmy, and you had Labour, Shakai Shugi, Socialists. Okay, so many of the Shakai Shugi came from the Jimmys. So in the 20th century, Liberal kind of breaks up into different groups. Conservative, Imademo, it's still one basic conservative kind of party. So the point is that in the 17th century, this party was more likely to support women's rights than this one, which seems strange to us today. Why would feminism start to develop in a right-wing political context? Well, in the 17th century, if you were in my class last term, in the 17th century, there was something called the Puritan Revolution. And it led to, on the Puritan side, let's put it up here, on the Puritan side, you had the Roundheads. They were famous soldiers of the Puritan army. They were called Roundheads because they had a little round helmet. Okay? And they developed into the Whig Party. Okay? So, 17世紀のピュリタンの革命、オリバー・クロンウェルとか、Oliver Cromwell, they developed slowly into the Whig Party. Now, if you were in my class last term, you'll remember the Puritans were not friends to women. Okay, the Puritans were a woman should be in the house. A woman should be a servant to the man. Okay, they had a very traditional idea about the position of women, seisho no kane, coming from the Bible. Okay, so the negative attitude towards women that you get from the Puritan and the Puritans and the Roundheads, and that feeds itself through into the Whig Party in the 18th century. All right? And it's based on the Bible. Whereas the Tory Party was the party that developed from the Royalists, the group that supported the king. All right? It led to something called Cavaliers. The Cavalier just means a horseman. Mostly the Puritans were of a rather lower social class. They were foot soldiers, okay, and they had their helmet, okay? The Cavaliers were of a higher social class. They owned their horse, damn it, I see a Puritan. Bang! Okay? Or something like that, all right? So they had sort of more sort of elegant, high-class kind of image. That elegant, high-class society was more open towards women. And after the Puritan Revolution, when Charles II came to be king, it was a great time for women. Women could, for the first time, they could act on the stage. Women could move around in society more freely. The Royalists had a more open attitude towards women, whereas the Puritans had a closed attitude towards women. The Whigs were not all of them Puritans, but they had developed from those Puritan origins, and they tended to have a more negative attitude towards women. Okay? So that really explains why these early feminists were comparatively socially conservative, and socially and politically conservative. When women marched on Parliament, this is a very extraordinary. If you were in my class last term, I talked about it. Not many people, when they're thinking about the history of June Anasaiki, not many people remember that women, thousands of them, marched on Parliament saying, "You men, stop attacking our king. You're damaging our country." Okay? And it was women going up to protect the king against the Puritans. All right? So the whole movement of women's kind of protest in Britain, in England, really has its beginnings in, we want to protect the king. What you people are doing is attacking the king. It's bad for the country. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for my husband's job. All right? Because he buys his food from France and sells it here. He doesn't want a big cacophony, a big revolution that's going to make problems with the international trading. We just want to do our jobs. Please stop. We don't want to say, shukyo, let's just live a very simple life because you people are Puritans. We actually want to have a rich life, and you're trying to stop us. So right from the early days, feminism was developing as something that supported the king against the Puritans, something that was more right-wing in today's thinking, and those were the early beginnings. So they wanted to keep the structure with the king at the top of society. They didn't support those people who wanted to go against the structure, the people who wanted to change society. As I say, right wing is basically keeping society como mama the way it is. Left wing is more about reform and change the society in an experimental way, moving towards some different kind of future. And women were better treated inside the right-wing framework at that time than in the left-wing framework. Does that make sense? Okay. Once the Puritan Revolution was over, once Oliver Cromwell died, the king came back, things got better for women. So naturally, again, women are thinking, if we have a king, we have a better life. We support this side, this right-wing kind of Tory side, because that's the side that supports the king. And so you get these women, as I say, Mary Astle was one of them, Mary Chudley, Judith Drake. People like this, they were growing up in London during the late 17th, early 18th century. And then you got the Blue Stocking Society, which also, mainly, not all of it, but the Blue Stocking Society was also, to a large extent, this kind of Tory feminism. Okay? So that's what we've largely got. And its conservative nature could be seen in its thinking about religion. what's important is to be, a good Christian, a moral person, to give charity. A lot of it was about onna no hito, kanemochi na onna no hito no imu. Okay, the obligations of privileged women, like the blue stockings, and educated women, should support the poor, should help the suffering. It's about, you have to be a good woman and you have to support those people who are suffering in society. And men should respect us because we are good women and because we support those who are suffering and because we give charity. And we also look after our husbands. We're perfect. We try to be perfect in every way. Okay? So that's the idea that you should respect us because we really try very hard, which is okay. Why not? Okay? But it's a little bit limited in its thinking, and it was later going to be challenged. The Whigs were on the other side of the political party, and they're the beginnings of the Liberal Party, okay? And their origins came from the Puritans of the 17th century. So, especially later on in the 18th century, you're starting to get women coming from the Whig side who are also feminists, or they're proto-feminists. They're interested in women's rights, but they're not from that right-wing Tory group that's saying, we give money to charity, we look after the poor, we look after our husbands, we're good women, so we should be respected. They're coming from a different position. Okay, the Tory feminists want women to be respected in a male-dominated society. The way to be respected is by being virtuous, by being good women, setting a good example, being kind of angels. Okay, everybody talks about that poem Angel in the House, but this was sort of mine. But something like that Angel in the House idea. But people like Macaulay and Wollstonecraft said, ちょっと待って、男の人、悪い人だっても尊敬する男だ。Why do we say that women only have to be equal if they're especially good? Men don't have to be especially good. Men can be really bad, but they're still respected because they're men. Okay? Automatically, if you're a man, you're higher up on the ladder. Even if you're a bad man, even if you're a lazy man, you're a man. Okay, so it's a double standard. It's not fair. So they would be more like saying, look, it's not about, if we're good women. It's not about if we educate the poor or help anybody. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. The point is that we should have equal rights just because we are human. Okay, not because we do anything, especially to get respect, but just the same as men. Men are born and they are considered to have certain rights. Why shouldn't women have rights in the same sort of way? Okay, can you see the difference in thinking there? They're not just saying, give us equal rights, give us respect because we behave well, because we are good, but because we should be equal, because we are all equal. They weren't always, they came very often from this more Whig, liberal, left-wing kind of position, but it doesn't mean that the Whig Party loved them, or that they loved, everything inside the Whig Party. So we call the Tory feminists, we call them Tory feminists because they are closely connected with the Tory Party. These women who are coming from this sort of more liberal context weren't always comfortable with the Whig Party in its thinking, because there was still some very heisateki men inside in those days, even right in the Whig Party. So they tend to be called Enlightenment Remember we talked about the Enlightenment, that's when science kind of opens the world up and people start thinking in terms of logic and reasonable lifestyle. They're living in cities with kind of coffee shop world, and that sort of world of the tea shop, the coffee shop. The tea shop was more often for women, the coffee shop more often for men. But that kind of social world, interested in science of different kinds, interested in history. Politics was a little bit of a taboo for women, but slowly politics as well. And they were just interested in these new ways of thinking that the world was developing, the Western world was developing at that time. And so we tend to call them Enlightenment feminists because they come from that background. Now here's a really interesting, extraordinary person. I don't know have you heard of her before? No? No? You haven't heard of her? Okay. She is interesting and not at all like what you probably expect. You've heard of Jane Austen, yeah? You've got this, maybe you read some Jane Austen and sort of got this image of very elegant women drinking tea and going for little walks in the countryside and having romantic relationships with men. And you've probably got a sort of clear image of that kind of society. Well, Mary Wollstonecraft was different. Her lifestyle is just as extraordinary, or I think probably actually her lifestyle is much more extraordinary than her writing. Okay? She was not the typical image of a good woman. Her behavior was the exact opposite of those Tory feminists, the kind of good woman who did all the good things and was free of all kind of scandal. On the contrary, she had a pretty scandalous life. First thing is that she fell in love with an artist, Henry Fuseli. She loved his erotic artwork. This sort of thing. Okay, she posed for him, all right, and she fell in love with him. Well, I mean, there was actually a problem there. Fuseli was married. But she said that her love for Fuseli was platonic love. It was an intellectual. He loved his mind. She loved his mind. So she said, let's live together. The three of us. Okay? I'm in love with your husband's mind. This is the 18th century, okay? Even today, if somebody came along and said, I love your husband, let's live together. Okay, I think even today, a lot of people would have a bit of a problem with that, okay? Although it's perhaps more likely to happen in Western society. It's not totally impossible in Western society today. You do get tripartite relationships. But in the 18th century, I mean, this was an embarrassment, okay? Fuseli and his wife were completely horrified. Okay? Is she crazy? Come he knocking on the door and saying, let's live together, the three of us? Is she really completely mad? And Fuseli, yeah, she is a bit mad. Okay, so he stuck with his wife. She was, made to feel bad.
Okay, what are you doing, you stupid young person? What do you think? You can't say things like that. You can't be like that. She was, in her mind, she was inside the romantic world of the romantic poetry, the new world that was opening up, the exciting world, and she believed it was all true. And then reality hit her. Okay? Her dream of a free society where people could love freely and beautiful dream, okay? I mean, I'm a child of the 1960s. We were all hippies, you see. I mean, it's a bit like that then, you know. But reality hits you, okay? It's just not going to work for one reason or another. People are jealous, or people have practical, lives to live. So she suffered at that time, and she left London. 29 years old, already famous, but apparently she was still a virgin. This is another thing. Although she was in love with Fuseli, it's not like she was sleeping with him or anything. She was apparently still a virgin. She had a very close friendship with a woman named Fanny Blood. Some people would say that was a lesbian friendship, but I don't think it's very clear either way. But that's another aspect of her life, okay? Very close friendships with women, scandalous relationships with married men. This is how she's coming into the world, all right? She leaves London at this point and she goes to Paris. There she falls in love with a man called Gilbert Imlay, and she has his child. But she doesn't marry. Okay? Again, having an unmarried child in 18th century England was kind of social suicide. And even worse, he didn't stay with her. After the child was born, he left her. Okay, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. He's off. Okay? And at this time, politically, we're at the time now of the French Revolution. And this is when she wrote her most famous work, which is A Vindication of the Rights of Women. To vindicate means to justify, to say, it's true, it's right. Problem? Where's the problem? And unusually you think, sorry, the print is wrong. She had an unusually close friendship on the bottom of page 1. Turn over, page 3, named Fanny Blood. Sorry, I'm full of mistakes this week. Okay, so the way that your pages go is you've got 1, 3, and then on the back you've got 2, 4. Sorry about that. Okay. I'll bet that until today you thought I was perfect, didn't you? Now I've messed up the video, I've messed up the web page, I've messed up the prints. My halo is slipping. So anyway, here we go. Have you managed to find the place? Yeah. So yes, you've got the front of the print here, page 1, page 3, page 2, page 4. Oh, in fact, yeah. What can you do? You could tear the page, and it would be easier for you to look at it. All right, if you want to. All right, but I think that's right. Yeah. Oh dear. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Is that right? 3, 4, I think. Or Is it even worse than yeah? Okay. Oh, it's the same page. Oh my God, it's the same page. Forget that. Forget, in that case, no. So, I think I think we seem to have 1, 3, 2. Is this what we've got? 1, 3, 2, 3. Is that what it is? Yeah. Oh well, just cross that one out. Okay. Yeah, I thought 4 pages is a bit long. It should be 3 pages. So I just put an extra page in by mistake. Okay, so that's what it should be. Does everybody understand where we're up to? Yeah? I'm sorry. Okay then. So the next thing is she's got this child. She goes back to England and she tries to kill herself twice. Okay, you're beginning to get the picture of an unstable woman. Okay, living a very kind of unstable and unusual life. You might think that she's probably more exciting to meet and talk to than Jane Austen, but she's not stable. But actually, Jane Austen, as we're going to see, Jane Austen is also very surprising. She's not as conservative as we imagine. So, yeah, she got pregnant again. Her life was in a terrible mess. And the child's father did marry her, and then she died. Okay? And then he wrote her life story. And he was very honest. He was too honest. It was too scandalous for the people in those days. So Mary Wollstonecraft became kind of famous for scandal because he wrote her life story too honestly. The child that they had was Mary Godwin, who grew up to marry the poet Shelley and who wrote the novel Frankenstein. So she had a famous daughter as well, Mary Shelley, the wife of the poet and the author of the famous novel Frankenstein. So, a vindication of the rights of women is Mary Wollstonecraft's most famous work. To understand it, we would have to look at the situation in France at this time, at the end of the 18th century. The political takeover of the French Revolution led to a huge opening up of discussion about what kind of society do we want, what kind of society, what kind of world should we make, how are we going to do this? Basically, the French Revolution, I think we talked about it a little bit before, 2 or 3 weeks ago, was kind of, it ended up with a very nasty scenario of just let's kill the rich. Okay, the rich have been horrible to us, let's just kill them off and let's start again. Usually when that happens, things don't get better. Okay, so you kill one lot of greedy people and another lot comes in, and very often they're even worse. So in the French Revolution, in many ways, yes, it was a kind of big step forward for the debate about human rights and, you know, the French motto to the liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. Liberty, yeah, freedom. Equality, yeah. But the third one, fraternity. Do you know what that word means? Frate is the Latin for brother. Fraternity means brotherhood. We're all brothers together. Can you see the problem? We're not sisters Okay, from a women's point of view, this was a problem. The French Revolution decided for liberty, great, yeah, women want liberty, they want freedom. Equality, yeah, women want equality. But fraternity, hey, come on, what happens to us sisters? You know, what do we do, okay? So they were being left out of the picture. And that was the context in which Mary Wollstonecraft was writing her very famous work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So in 1789, the National Assembly, which was kind of trying to guide the country through the revolution after the old system, the king and the royal family and that elite had been pushed out of power and indeed put to death, they passed they passed a declaration of the rights of man. The rights of man, the rights of the citizen, and very clearly, this was for men. It's a man's world. So women were very, very disappointed. We've got this revolution, here's a chance to sort of have a society where men and women are equal, and what do? Bloody men take control of it. And it's going to be freedom for them. It's going to be equality for them. Okay? So the French Revolution, from a woman's point of view, was messed up from the beginning. All right? It started off with a possibility for women to be equal, but that was rejected, and it was made just a sort of policy for basically for men. Women, as far as the French Revolution was concerned, it seemed that women's lives were not going to change very much. So a few months later, a few weeks later, thousands of women marched on the King's Palace. So a turning point in the revolution. They presented the women's petition to the National Assembly. They said, look, we don't want it just to be a declaration of the rights of man. We want it to be a declaration of the rights of men and women. You know, why not? What's wrong with that? So women made their voice heard at this time in the French Revolution. Again, similar in a way to the way that women had made their voice heard in the Puritan Cacumet, in the Puritan Revolution in England in the 17th century. And so the sense of solidarity, the sense that women could get together and they could form a protest, all of that was there. But yeah, the result then was that women's rights were focused on. The men hadn't really thought about the women. Oh yeah, women, oh yeah, we're forgetting about you guys. Oh well, let's see. And a woman wrote a French book on the Declaration of the Rights of Women in 1791, Henri de Gouges. The rights of woman and the female citizen. You can see the way that it's expressed. It's exactly the Assembly, the French Assembly, which was all men, had published their Declaration of the Rights of Man and the male citizen. So she publishes a Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the female citizen. What do you think is going to happen? Well, unfortunately, Gouges is put to death by the revolutionaries. Now, Wollstonecraft published her English work, which was obviously influenced by the French work, in 1792, and then 1 year later, the French woman had her head chopped off. So that gives you a sense, again, when I was talking last term about women in the 17th century, those women who went and protested, they were being very brave. Because this was a society where women could be very, very severely punished. They could be tied to a cart and pulled through the streets with somebody whipping them. All right? Very severely punished. Or they could be, yes, they could be hanged, or they could be put to death in some way. So feminism meant something to these people, okay? She wrote a book about the rights of women, they chopped her head off, okay? Yeah, our friend Mary Wollstonecraft was right in the middle of all of that. She was there in France at that time. But what is interesting here is, in spite of her very adventurous and unusual life, the writing itself, the vindication of the rights of woman, this book itself, doesn't really say anything that's very new. It's famous for us now, and feminists will often point to it as the first real feminist publication, but I don't actually agree. Those other women, you know, Mary Chudley, Mary Astle, those the women that I wrote, that are on your print, whose names came up at the beginning of the 18th century and the end of the 17th century, are saying almost exactly the same thing as she's saying. Okay? Except that they're saying it from the point of view of the conservative feminist, whereas she's saying it from the point of view of the liberal feminist. But most of the ideas that women should get an equal education to men and so on, most of those ideas are pretty similar. And against the argument that women can't reason intellectually, Wollstonecraft says that's because they haven't had the education that would make it possible for them to reason in an intellectual way. They can't, women can only talk about, oh, that's a lovely piece of ribbon that you've got on your bonnet. Where did you get that? Oh, I got it down from such and such a shop. And did you know it's only a shilling for a yard? And that's all the women could talk about, these little trivia of fashion and so on, because they've not been taught anything else. They haven't been taught about history or politics or kind of scientific topics or anything like that. That's all they had to talk about. So if you haven't had that kind of education, how can you talk about those kinds of things? So she puts forward that argument, but it's exactly the same argument that had been put forward by people like Mary Astle earlier on in the century, or the late 17th century. And she also, just as the Tory feminists did, pretty much everybody in those days had to accept the idea of God, and she uses God as part of her persuasion that women should have equal rights. God made us equal, okay? Not just we are equal, but God made us equal. So it's God's will that we should be treated equally, okay? So using religion as part of her argument, which again is more on the sort of Tory side of things, all right? God, of course, is a man, male, in the Bible. It's always he. So she's actually not as radical as people often paint her. She says that children get their earliest education from their mothers, so well-educated women will make better parents. All of these arguments have been put forward years and years before. They're not actually original. Come on. There. Yeah, in all these points and many others, she's basically just echoing what other people like Mary Astle had already said. So it's not so much what she actually writes that makes her book so important. It's the context of revolution. She's writing it from the point of view of the French Revolution, a challenge to society. It's that background that makes her work so radical. In itself, the things that she's saying are not so different. In fact, very often they're the exact same things that other women had been saying like 100 years before. So, here's Mary Wollstonecraft then, and her extraordinary lifestyle against the background of the French Revolution. Now we move on to Jane Austen. Couldn't imagine, when you first think about it, that anybody could be more conservative than Jane Austen. She's so different from the adventurous, scandalous Mary Wollstonecraft. She seems staid, conservative, stable, reliable, inside kind of middle-class environment in those years towards the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. But you know, appearances don't always tell us what's going on inside. And the way that Jane Austen has been presented to us may be a little bit different from the reality. The details of her life were not made public until after her death, and her husband, William Godwin, published, I'm getting confused, sorry. Mary Wollstonecraft, the details of her life were not really known until after she died, when, as I said, Godwin, her husband, published this scandalous kind of very honest, rather too honest, account of her life. So she became known for kind of scandal and shameful, in those days, way of life. When she was alive, her reputation was based on her writings, but later on, her reputation became based on her lifestyle. So really, I think I agree here with Maria Reif, who says that Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of woman, the foundational work of Enlightenment feminist philosophy, endorses a feminism that is surprisingly conservative. She's not actually as radical in her writing as she seems when we think about her in the context of her lifestyle. What she actually says in her writing is quite conservative. Jane Austen is an interesting contrast. Because Jane Austen's life was supposed to be very, very staid, very conservative. And her life was, again, at least partly, the Jane Austen that we know is reconstructed after her death by, in this case, by her brother and her nephew. And they did exactly the opposite of Mary Wollstonecraft's husband. He wrote her life. Look at the amazing life that my wife had. Look how she did this, and she had this baby with this guy that she never married, and she went and knocked on this artist's door, and look at all the amazing things she did. Isn't she kind of scandalous but wonderful? Okay? Whereas what these people did, they said, let's present the world a very conservative, very safe picture of our dead relative. So the Jane Austen that we have today is perhaps rather more conservative than the reality. She certainly wasn't anything like as wild as Mary Wollstonecraft, but there were incidents in her life, and there was even apparently, well, there was romance in her life. It's one thing that's certain is that she was proposed to. She said yes, and then she said, "Yeah, Paddy, no." Okay, so she was strong enough to say, to take a sort of feminist position, if you like, and say, "I'm not going to live with just any old man just because he asks me. I don't actually like him. I don't want to be stuck with him. Okay, I'd sooner be by myself." And that's what she did. So yeah, there are indications that her life was perhaps a little bit more interesting than we often imagine. And in her writing, we've got this sort of gentle irony of Jane Austen, very famous for her gentle irony. Sorry, I found that before. We've got some quite radical attacks on the prejudices of her society. This is one of the really interesting things when you read Jane Austen. You can see how it all seems kind of very narrow, very little world, and not much happens. But the comments can sometimes be, oh, much more powerful than you might imagine. I'll talk about that in a little bit if we have a bit of time at the end. There's no real evidence that she actually read Wollstonecraft's work, but I think on balance, probably she did. And even more than that, I think there are other connections. The author of a book that it's written by a man, but it presents us with a sort of early feminist, proto-feminist heroine. You can see there, she's a powerful lady. She's got the gun, okay? She's the sort of strong heroine. And novels like this that were presenting strong women, written by men or written by women, were changing the image that people were having of women at that time. Now this man, Robert Page, his novel's not particularly famous, but he wrote this novel with a feminist kind of strong heroine protagonist, and Jane Austen owned his book. And we know that he supported Mary Wollstonecraft. So he supported Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen had his book. Okay, well, it's not a direct connection, but we do have several connections of that kind. Okay, his novel advocating the equality of men and women. What else have we got? Claire Tomalin, if you're interested in like the life of some of these famous writers from this period, she writes very good lives, a kind of biography of these people's lives. She notices that there is actually a family connection between Jane Austen and Mary Wollstonecraft. Jane Austen's father was a rector. That means he's not exactly a Shinpo-sama, but kyokai no kanki. Okay, he's connected with the church, and a rector it's a steady job, it's a safe job, but you don't get all that much money. So to get a bit more money, he was teaching privately. He was giving boys education at home, so he was a tutor. And one of the boys that he was a tutor to was called Gilbert East, and he was the son of a man called William East, who was a friend of Jane Austen's aunt and uncle. Okay, chottamatte. Let's get the connection here. William East knew Mary Wollstonecraft. And of course, Jane knew her aunt and uncle. And okay, the connection is, again, it's not guaranteed that she must therefore have known Mary Wollstonecraft, but she's pretty close. William East was especially kind to Mary Wollstonecraft when she had that time when she tried to kill herself. He looked after her, he helped her at that time. So he was pretty close to her. He's close to the friends of Jane Austen's aunt and uncle. There are kind of probabilities there that even if she didn't know him, even if she didn't know her, even if Jane Austen didn't know Mary Wollstonecraft, she would have heard stories about her. through this family connection. You have to remember that these people didn't have television, okay, where they'd sit, watching a movie all day. They would talk. So what's the news then? Oh, my friend has taken in a young woman who was living in France and tried to kill herself. That story would have been told by everybody who knew her. Okay, that's a good story. Okay, Jane Austen would have heard those stories. She would have known something about Mary Wollstonecraft. Quite probably being the intellectually curious woman that she was, she would have said, Mary Wollstonecraft lived in France, tried to kill herself, wrote a book, sounds interesting, I'll go to the library and I'll get her book. Okay? I think it's probably more likely than not, to be honest. Right? And there's a good chance that she read Mary Wollstonecraft's book. So we don't really know if Jane Austen met Mary Wollstonecraft, but she would have heard about her, she would know something about her. And it's also possible even that she carefully doesn't mention Mary Wollstonecraft directly because she doesn't want to be too close to the scandals that Mary Wollstonecraft was involved with. So it may be that she met her, she talked to her, she knew her reasonably well, but she didn't make that information public because Mary Wollstonecraft was kind of connected with scandal. So it's difficult to make an argument from what people don't say, but it's a possibility. A hint that that possibility may be correct comes from the names that Jane Austen uses in her novels for some of her characters. If you read her books, you'll notice that the names nearly always have some sort of meaning. Right? Mr. Knightley is the knight. Okay? It comes up all the time in her work. The places, the people, their names usually have some kind of meaning. So in Mansfield Park again, Mansfield. Okay, Mansfield Park. She has the character Fanny Price. Quite possibly she's referring to Fanny Blood. Okay, the woman that Mary Wollstonecraft had a very close relationship with. And possibly she's referring to Richard Price, who was a very close friend of Mary Wollstonecraft's. So that in choosing two names that are closely connected with Mary Wollstonecraft, that she may be hinting a connection with Mary Wollstonecraft herself, that Fanny Price is sort of associated with Mary Wollstonecraft. Again, Maria Rife has quite a strong argument, I think, that Fanny Price is Jane Austen's experiment in creating an Enlightenment feminist heroine, a protagonist who represents the ideals of Enlightenment feminism. I think she's got a strong argument here, and I think there are other strong arguments for similar conclusions in other novels of Jane Austen's. Okay, I'll move on in a sec. People are still writing things down, so I'll wait a minute before moving on. Are we? Yeah? I must have put a long sentence. Did I put a long bit for you to fill in there? Okay, well, there you go then. So that's that one. The beginning of this idea that Jane Austen was connected with Mary Wollstonecraft, that idea first came out in a paper written in 1973, a guy called Lloyd Brown, Jane Austen and the Feminist Tradition. If you're interested in this subject, you should probably read all of these critics that I've mentioned here, Claire Tomalin and Brown, and the various critics have written about these kinds of connections. And
Brown focuses on persuasion and Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is probably, if you know a Jane Austen novel, it's going to be Emma or Pride and Prejudice for most people. So some of you may know Pride and Prejudice. And he looks at the connection between Jane Austen and Enlightenment feminists, and particularly Mary Wollstonecraft, in the way that she writes about female feelings, or the psychology of women, and the discussion of female education. And he says that her skepticism on those kinds of topics, particularly education, places her closer to Mary Wollstonecraft and more at odds, more against the male experts like Fordyce and Gisborne. People had, until then, they usually see Jane Austen inside the sort of male tradition. She's a woman, an isolated woman, writing inside a man's world. More recently, people see her more, no, she's a woman together with other women who are writing in a man's world. There are closer connections between her and the Enlightenment feminists than people often imagined. For example, she often shows unsatisfactory marriages. Do you remember the ridiculous Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice? He's proposing to... Do you know this novel? Yeah? Well, he is a complete idiot, really. Charlotte is Elizabeth's best friend. Mr. Collins was first interested in proposing to Elizabeth, or actually first he wants to propose to Elizabeth's sister, but the mother says Elizabeth instead, and he says, oh yeah, Elizabeth, you know, it's like he doesn't care which woman he proposes to, just somebody. He thinks that she's sure to say yes, because he will get her family's money when her father dies. Again, she does not care about that. She says, no, I could never be happy with a man like you. And Elizabeth's best friend, Charlotte, then comes to say, Mr. Collins proposed to me. Elizabeth says, oh, what are you going to do? He's a white boy. I'm going to marry him. Elizabeth is very disappointed in her best friend at this point. And she says, the best friend says, I think I'll be as happy as most married women. Elizabeth says, Sonotoi. Exactly. That's the problem. Most married women are not happy. And you'll be just as happy as those unhappy women. And that's what happens in the novel. Okay? So, that's kind of clever irony, isn't it? You know, I'll be as happy as most women. Yeah, probably will. Okay? Meaning, they are not happy, and you won't be either. She's a very clever writer, Jane Austen. So, Elizabeth herself, we can see connections between Jane Austen's heroine and Mary Wollstonecraft's ideal woman. The wildness, the independent spirit. Elizabeth, when she hears that her sister is not well, she goes across the countryside. She arrives where her sister is staying. Her dress is all messed up and her shoes are muddy. She doesn't look like an elegant lady, but what does she care? Okay, she's got that kind of wild spirit. And Jane Austen, obviously, wants to show those kind of women who just don't care about those kinds of things. Instead of the woman who is always trying to be perfect and look fashionable and elegant. And she also talks about education. Men have every advantage of us, she says in Persuasion, of telling their own story Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands. And there she is, a woman with the pen in her hand. And she's going to tell her story. She's going to tell women's story. There's a strong feminist intent behind Jane Austen. Well, you're saved by the bell. Women are silly in Jane Austen's work, but that's usually pointed to the weakness of their education. They've been brought up to know no better. I think I've got a few more things to say here, but yeah, I'll just put them up quickly on here. You can check the print. You can check it in the on the web page. Okay. There's more than just coincidence. It's very likely that Jane Austen is much more closely connected to Mary Wollstonecraft than people have imagined. Okay, the bell's gone. We're going to have to finish there.